Many Americans were disturbed by the rise of Nazis and fascists in Europe and, to a lesser extent, by Japanese aggression in Asia. But the United States remained firmly isolationist throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, and actually became more so as the situation overseas worsened. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. FDR was not a natural isolationist, but at that time, his nation was consumed by the Great Depression. More than ever, the American people felt it was time to focus on domestic problems at home and not on foreign affairs. In many ways, isolationism was the natural status quo for American foreign policy. As he prepared to leave office in 1796, none other than George Washington had warned his new countrymen that we should not entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition. The U.S. had actually broken with more than a century of tradition by entering World War I on the side of the Allies. And after the war, Americans had turned inward again, electing a Republican president, Warren Harding, who promised a return to normalcy. There was a widespread American belief in the 1920s and 30s that the involvement of the U.S. in the First World War had been a mistake. The war hadn't solved the world's problems or made it safe for democracy. In 1934, the U.S. Senate actually created a committee headed by Senator Gerald Nye to investigate long-standing claims that weapons manufacturers had pushed the U.S. to enter World War I for their own profit. While the Nye Committee didn't find any evidence of such a conspiracy, it did conclude that America had joined the war in large part to protect its own financial interests. The findings made the American people even more cynical and reluctant to become involved in overseas conflicts, in Asia, in Europe, or anywhere else. Let's practice. Interventionism best describes the policy of the United States in response to Japanese aggression in the 1930s. Click thumbs up if this statement is true, and thumbs down if it's false. You got it! The best word to describe U.S. foreign policy in the 1930s is isolationism. America didn't want to get involved in the problems of other nations. Interventionism is basically the opposite of that. With an interventionist foreign policy, the U.S. might have tried to interfere with or stop Japan's aggressive actions. In 1935 and 1936, Congress passed the first Neutrality Acts, intended to keep the U.S. out of a future war. These laws barred Americans from selling weapons or war materials to any other nations at war. They made no distinctions between nations. Great Britain and Nazi Germany, for example, were treated exactly the same. The Neutrality Act of 1937 took things even further. It forbid American ships to carry passengers or goods to nations at war, and it forbid U.S. citizens to travel on the ships of nations at war. These acts were designed to prevent the mistakes of World War I that had drawn America into war against Germany. President Roosevelt was critical of these acts. He felt they would limit his administration's ability to support friendly nations if a war did come. But he could not ignore the clear will of the American people and his voters, and he signed them into law. But FDR did convince Congress to add a provision to the 1937 Act known as cash and carry. Under this policy, the U.S. could sell non-military goods to other nations, but only if they paid for the goods in cash and transported them entirely on their own ships. The provision was set to expire in 2 years. Roosevelt hoped that if Britain and France did go to war with Germany, that cash and carry might allow America to support them in some small way. When Japan invaded China in 1937, FDR took advantage of cash and carry to support the Chinese. China paid for American supplies, and British ships in the Pacific transported the goods. Isolationists in the U.S. strongly criticized the president. They thought he was placing the United States on a path to world war again. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was one of the leading isolationists in the United States. Thumbs up or thumbs down? That's it. FDR was not a true isolationist, but he was the President of the United States at a very isolationist time in history. Roosevelt believed, more so than most Americans at the time, that it was necessary to support democratic allies and stand up against fascism and Nazism. But he could not ignore the isolationist feelings of Americans in the 1930s. By 1936, Adolf Hitler was ready to make a bold move. Since taking power as the Nazi Führer, he started to rearm Germany, secretly building tanks, planes, and weapons in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, in March 1936, Hitler ordered Nazi troops into the Rhineland, a western region of Germany right on the border with neighboring France. According to the Versailles Treaty, the large region was supposed to be a permanent demilitarized zone. This meant that Germany was not supposed to have any soldiers or weapons in the region, leaving a buffer zone between it and France. Now, Hitler boldly defied the treaty by remilitarizing the Rhineland. How did Germany's neighbors respond? Violating the peace terms that Germany had agreed to at the end of the last war could have, and probably should have, meant Great Britain and France declaring war on Germany. But the British and French were desperate to avoid another bloody world war. Their nations had been harmed by the last war almost as much as the losers like Germany. France and Britain weren't exactly isolationist like the US was at the time, but they believed in 1936 that it was better to appease Hitler, to give him what he wanted if it meant avoiding war. Having rearmed the Rhineland with no consequences, Hitler was emboldened. He had gambled that the former allies of the last war would not move to stop him, and he was right. Just 1 month later, an Italian army completed its invasion of Ethiopia in East Africa, enlarging Italy's empire under Mussolini. Hitler had supported the invasion, but most other nations were outraged. Once again, the League of Nations was powerless to solve the crisis or defend Ethiopia, just as it had been unable to respond to Japan's invasion of Manchuria several years earlier. Also in 1936, a brutal 3-year civil war began in Spain when General Francisco Franco, a fascist dictator in the mold of Benito Mussolini, attempted to overthrow Spain's democratically elected government. Germany and Italy aided Franco by giving his side soldiers and weapons. Because the Nazis were able to try out many new weapons and military strategies during the Spanish Civil War, some have called it a dress rehearsal for World War II. Without support from the international community, Spain's government fell to the fascists, giving Hitler and Mussolini a new ally in General Franco. In 1937, Japan invaded China. The developments around the world gravely concerned President Roosevelt. He spoke directly to isolationist Americans in October of that year in what has become known as the Quarantine Speech. FDR spoke of war as a contagion and warned Americans that the epidemic of world lawlessness was spreading in a way that would eventually infect everyone. He warned against isolation and neutrality and suggested that America should lead the world in using economic pressure to quarantine aggressive nations like Japan, Italy, and Germany. This meant to isolate them in a way that would stop their ability to wage war. Instead of changing American minds, Roosevelt's speech was met with a harsh backlash from isolationist leaders in his own country. The president backed down, remarking that it's a terrible thing to look over your shoulder when you're trying to lead and find no one there. In 1938 and 1939, Hitler's Germany embarked on a path that would soon bring almost all of Europe under Nazi rule. Using the excuse of reuniting German-speaking people everywhere, Hitler bullied neighboring Austria to join with Germany and to be incorporated into what he now called the Third Reich, the new German Empire. Just months later, Hitler announced his intention to annex or take the Sudetenland, a region of neighboring Czechoslovakia. This region had been German before World War I. Now Hitler wanted it back. Both Britain and France had a treaty with Czechoslovakia that promised to defend it if it were invaded. The Czechs were willing to fight to protect their territory, but the leaders of Britain and France traveled to Munich, Germany in September 1938 to meet with Hitler in person. They still hoped to avoid a war by striking a grand bargain with the Nazis. In Munich, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain took the lead in negotiating with Hitler. Hitler promised that if Germany could have the Sudetenland, he would leave the rest of Czechoslovakia alone and seek no more territory in Europe. Chamberlain and the other negotiators accepted the deal. They had once again appeased Hitler, but Chamberlain returned home to great acclaim and proudly announced that he had returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Winston Churchill, a member of the British Parliament, disagreed. Churchill had been warning his countrymen of the danger posed by Hitler for years and believed that appeasement was a huge mistake. "We have suffered a total and unmitigated defeat," Churchill stated after the Munich conference. "England has been offered a choice between war and shame. She has chosen shame and will get war." Winston Churchill was proven right in March 1939. The Nazis boldly marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia and easily conquered the country. Hitler had simply lied at Munich. Almost immediately, Hitler demanded that Poland, another bordering nation, return territory it had been awarded after World War I. This time, Britain and France realized that Hitler could not be trusted and would never be stopped except in a war. There would be no further appeasement. Both nations promised that they would defend Poland by going to war with Germany if it was invaded. Poland's other neighbor to the east was the Soviet Union, the former Russian Empire, now a communist nation under the rule of Joseph Stalin. Stalin ruled the Soviet Union as a dictator and was, in his own way, as brutal a leader as Hitler was. Nonetheless, the two men opposed and distrusted each other. Hitler hated communism and often spoke of the Russian people as subhuman. So it stunned the world in August 1939 when the Nazis and the Soviets announced that they had signed a treaty of non-aggression. It was something short of an alliance, but Hitler and Stalin both agreed not to attack the other or stand in each other's way. They also agreed to divide Poland's territory up between them. Now Germany could invade Poland without worrying about provoking Stalin to the east. For this practice, arrange these events in chronological order by dragging and dropping them into the right sequence, from first or earliest to occur to last or latest. Well done! From 1936 to 1939, Hitler pursued an aggressive series of actions that would start World War II in Europe. It's been a pleasure learning with you so far. This isn't the end of the story, but it is the end of part 1 of this tutorial. In part 2, you'll learn about the start of World War II in Europe